Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences. Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Hi, I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why, Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. Today we'll be exploring Indigenous philosophy with our guest, Brian Burkhart. In the 15th and 16th century, Spanish conquistadors came to the land that we now call the Americas, stole it from approximately 50 million inhabitants, enslaved many, massacred even more, and committed a genocide that some scholars suggest reduced the population to as few as 6 million people. To justify this, the Spaniards drafted El Requerimiento, a declaration articulating the king and queen of Spain's divine right to control this foreign land and its people. The requirement, or the demand as it can be translated, argued that because the Native Americans rejected Christ, dominion was their own fault. It told them that if they accepted the rule of their new masters voluntarily, they would be treated with love and charity. They were not telling the truth. The Spaniards would read this declaration to locals in order to get them to, and this is a quote, deliberate upon it and acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world. Well, they wouldn't exactly read it to the locals. They would indeed read it out loud, but they would do it in Spanish to uncomprehending listeners who couldn't speak this foreign language. Sometimes they would announce it to empty beaches or abandoned villages or recite it to prisoners they had already captured. They would even proclaim its words towards the visible land from the decks of their ships while sailing along the coast. In other words, the Spaniards would announce this bizarre legalistic declaration to either nobody or to people who had no opportunity to understand it, no exposure to Christianity, and no reason to believe in Christ's divinity, even if they knew what the Spaniards were talking about in the first place. The Spanish requirement of 1513 is a philosophical document as much as it's a political one, and represents everything disingenuous about colonialism. It attempts to contextualize dominion in terms of justice, morality, and legitimate rule without any defensible account of what those concepts actually signify. It presumes that there's one truth that governs all people, that there is a single representative who has access to that truth, and that this truth is knowable, defensible, and accurately described. It insists that everyone must accept this truth as believable, binding, and authoritative, and that its claims are so obviously true that any rejection of it can only be the consequence of ignorance and barbarism. The Spaniards divided the world into civilized and savage, and of course, they were deemed the very standard of what civilization meant. The conquistadors predate the advent of what we call modern philosophy by a little more than a century. But its view of truth, as well as its world order, would influence many of the most important thinkers in the Western tradition. When Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," when Thomas Hobbes argued that people should accept the government that offers them the most safety, when John Locke introduced the idea that property is something that we create through labor, they all canonized a worldview that would justify the exploitation and marginalization of indigenous peoples until today. This is at least what our guest argues. According to him, Western philosophy is so steeped in colonialism that even its discussions of truth and morality are determined by it. If this is the case, then every one of us who does philosophy endorses a colonialist point of view without necessarily knowing it. Whenever we ask the great philosophical questions, things like what is real, why be moral, what does it mean to be who I am, we are, whether we like it or not, oppressing and exploiting people who we might otherwise want to liberate. Understood this way, Western philosophy exploits indigenous people, folks with little power deemed unworthy by our political and philosophical systems, who are told that they aren't entitled to their own histories, experiences, or worldview. In the case of the native North Americans, who we'll be focusing on today, they become, in the words of George Tinker, said to me here on Y Radio a few years back, wholly owned subsidiaries of white folk in America. On today's episode, we're going to look at this pre- and post-colonial critique of Western philosophy and explore what indigenous philosophy might look like were it understood on its own terms. We're going to shed light on the dark assumptions that have permeated Western thought for centuries and offer, Not necessarily an alternative view, but a glimpse into an approach towards knowledge and understanding that is rarely acknowledged outside Native circles. What does it mean to do Indigenous philosophy? How does it take people's relationship to land and local culture seriously? What can it teach us about the world that we don't know and about ourselves that many of us can't see? How do kinship, history, and what our guest calls a trickster methodology reveal truths that have motivated people for millennia? And how can everyone explore them with the respect that they deserve? When the Spaniard used the requirement to justify their erasure of people and culture, there were some dissenting voices, but they held little sway and made no difference. It's 500 years later on, and on some level, those objections are still being disregarded. Indigenous philosophy is one tool we can use to insist that the injustice of the past be acknowledged, even if it can never be rectified. Cultivating a more inclusive picture of philosophy as a discipline is a moral imperative. Recognizing its shortcomings and pushing it to evolve is more than ever an absolute necessity. And now our guest. Brian Burkhart is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma and affiliated faculty in Native American studies. He's the author of the book Indigenizing Philosophy Through the Land, a trickster methodology for decolonizing environmental ethics and Indigenous futures, published by Michigan State University Press. Brian, welcome to Why.
Thank you very much. Hello.
To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show and tag us on social networks. Our handle is always at Y Radio Show, at WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platform so that others can find the show. And listen to 18 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show, Philosophical Currents, at our website, yradioshow.org. And as always, the show can only happen with your support. We exist solely on listener contributions. So click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation through the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. Okay, so Brian, I've contextualized a little bit of what we're talking about, but I wanted to start by asking you a very basic question. Why do we need a category called Indigenous philosophy? Isn't philosophy supposed to cover the full range of human philosophical thought? Why this label? Why this category?
So, first of all, I say OCO and the gods say hello, everyone, in Jalagi Gawanihisti, my Cherokee language. One of the things that I think is important, kind of from what you framed even so far, we can imagine a world where people from all over different cultures, different languages came together in a space that was open and uncompromised to sit and discuss their particular points of view, all based on building that kind of way of speaking out of the different experiences that people had, and maybe come to something in that process that was beyond their individual, perhaps, eccentricities. But that's not what we have. As you described, the nature of what we call the philosophical canon or philosophical practice is a very idiosyncratic and particular way of thinking and a way of practicing, of articulating what is true and knowledge and reality, that then comes from a particular place in a particular time, and then is universalized through the kind of framework of coloniality that I described, the process of taking that particular away from its groundedness in land and place and turning it into something that floats free from the land as just the truth writ large. And so when that happens, all of these things that we talk about that are supposedly universal are really very particular. And if we look at them, even just as you did, start looking at some of the pieces, you see the little places where they come, they are not, in fact, these sort of things that just sit outside of space and time, floating free from the land, as I speak of it. And so what happens is that more work has to be done to try to engage that framework of universality through some kind of contrasting, particular. And it's a great challenge because oftentimes the people who are doing these kind of universalizing gestures don't even sort of see it for what it is, right? How it comes out of these particular ways of seeing that, in fact, in their projection, already erase or eradicate or obscure all the particularities that exist now and have existed in, people and places. And so a conversation that isn't just about difference has to take place, because what happens with difference is oftentimes it just gets absorbed. Oh, there's something different. So how is it like the one true thing that is universal, rather than this is a particular, that's a particular. How do we have a conversation with each other? It's always the thing that is particular in the Western kind of canon is already universal. And so everything either fits into that or it needs to be rejected as just false or savage or whatever in a more pejorative sense.
When I looked
Yes.
at your bios across the web and doing research, many people start off your biography with you're an enrolled member of the Cherokee tribe. Yet in the
Yes.
book, one of the things you discuss is the fact that Indian voices are often evaluated purely in terms of whether they're authentic or not, whether or not
Yeah.
they fully represent that experience. And so I was reluctant to include that information in my introduction for you because I didn't want to do what you were criticizing in the book. So is it right or wrong, or both or neither, to introduce you before I tell people you have a PhD, before I tell you write the book, before I tell them that you're an associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, by identifying you as a member of this tribe to advertise that authenticity? What's the right thing to do in that circumstance?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that your sense that in some ways it's both is accurate, right? Because there's a way that, part of what I'm criticizing in the way that people think about Indigenous people, Native Americans, as sort of valuable or even real in terms of their authenticity. It's a part of thinking of them as artifacts, right, of the past, because we're thinking about, even this idea of post Columbian, or, we always sort of describe these things. When Columbus came, everything changed because the people that were here in their natural state, they disappear or they're frozen in time, right? And they can never change. And the joke I always sort of tell in my classes to kind of think about how silly this is I sort of ask them. I remember there were these people. I've seen lots of pictures of them. They were here around New England and so on. Some point they had these sort of buckles on their shoes, and they had sort of buckles on their hats, and they wore these sort of funny hats. Whatever happened to those people? Did they disappear? They must have just disappeared. I don't see them around anymore. And part of what I'm saying there is that there's this idea that, like, of course, those people are here. They just changed, right? They can do different things. They're not frozen in time as an artifact. But Indigenous people are, and it's part of that dehumanizing sort of framework that you are just this thing of the past. And if you stay in the past, and you can be real as an artifact, but it doesn't allow Indigenous people to be themselves and to articulate themselves in all of those dynamics, right? I am a philosophy professor. I have a PhD. I've done all these things. But for me and for a lot of Indigenous people, our kind of relationality, our culture, our language, the people we're related to are also just as important. It's not as if those things aren't important, but just how they're articulated as artifacts of us of an ancient time that we can't exist now and have all those things and have PhDs and do, be philosophy professors while being Cherokee and speaking Cherokee language are the things that we deny.
You use this great example in the book. You're talking about the Sierra Club. I think it was in New Mexico, if I remember correctly, but I could be wrong, where they are arguing that the land should be kept pristine so that Native Americans can continue to use or worship it. And you respond in the book by saying Native Americans can't have the land pristine because they're on it. They use it, they live on it, they roll on the field, whatever. And that there's this idea that the humanity and the participation gets erased when we talk about native cultures in just this way, that native cultures are so much a part of the land that even though they're human beings, they're still going to be pristine land. Is that the kind of
Yeah.
thing that we're struggling with here?
Yeah, I think it is the same. It's a lot of the same kind of conceptual framework of, you might call it on one hand civilized versus savage, right? It's even humans versus nature. It's that same thing, right? Because the idea is that there are people that are just natural. They're animalistic or they're just a part of nature. And then there are people that are human beings. They exist apart from nature and they build culture and they have ideas and they go through changes, and this sort of separation is the kind of thing that sets up not only sort of these identities about artifacts or people, but even relationships to nature. Because you either are just a part of the land, like, a bear or a tree or whatever in some way, or you're separate from it, and it's just a thing for you that you have as property, you use as resource. And that kind of framework is also situating how we think about people, but also how we think about indigenous people in relationship to nature or ecological processes.
Does the word natural even make sense when you're talking about people or peoples, whatever words we want to use? Aristotle, when he first makes the distinction, he distinguishes between nature and artifact, and the distinction for him,
Yeah.
simplified, is artifact is something created by human hands, nature is something created by not human hands. And so if you have natural people, are they less human? Do they create their own world less than other humans? Is the word natural fair to use in this context at all?
I mean, it's very much a problematic word, right? Because of the history of how it's kind of conceptualized, in particular, how it's used in relationship to people, because it does dehumanize, right? When people are just natural, then the idea is they're not really human, because humans are not natural, right? They're not just a part of the land. Those are animals, right? And that's how we sort of conceptualize oftentimes animals or pieces of nature, rivers or trees. The humans are of a totally different order. And if you're just sort of participating within that sort of framework, you're by definition not human, or at least less human, right? But it's a challenge. I talk about it in the book. Like, how do we, we've got a lot of these terms that are sort of structured in various problematic ways: the human, nature, even animal, right? Animal is not, it already sort of has a kind of separation in some ways of human and animal. These are not terms that ever exist in indigenous languages. There's no term for animal. Lots of animals, that we call it, are related to human beings, right? There's categories of beings that include animals and humans in one category, or even humans and mountains in Navajo. The mountains and the Navajo people are both Zilt. They stand upright, and there's this kind of category where they're one thing in that category. There's a lot of challenges of trying to take all this stuff that's sort of conceptualized in the background and begin to talk within it a relationship to try to reveal in indigenous philosophy. And that's part of why I use the trickster methodology, both in relationship to what we talked about in the beginning as a structural problem of the universalizing a particular thought, and that just by almost default erases or obscures all this difference underneath it, but also this challenge of trying to work in a very complicated way where you can't just speak the words, you have to speak in between and around them in ways that reveal something more than categories that we assume just kind of naturally that come from them.
Given this linguistic difference and this idea that the term animal, the category animal, doesn't exist in the native languages, do you see the world or experience the world differently when you're speaking English than when you're speaking Cherokee? Does it fundamentally change how you're processing your experience while it's happening?
I think absolutely. I grew up speaking some Cherokee. I'm mostly an adult learner of Cherokee, but I grew up speaking Navajo. I was born on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona. I've lived in a number of places that are indigenous homelands here in the US. And in both of those languages, too, there's a lot of similarity at certain basic conceptual levels, not only even these kind of particular categorizations that are like a number of terms that just don't exist or have no kind of relevance at all, that are very fundamental to Western philosophy, even like notions of evil and sin, right? There's no cognates whatsoever. But not only those particular terms, even just the way that language works. And I talk about this some in the book, but there's lots of great work on this in all sorts of spaces about indigenous language, which obviously philosophy language is very important for philosophy. We kind of take it for granted, oftentimes speaking in English, that we're sort of working within a kind of conceptual framework already. But like in Cherokee and Navajo, like a lot of indigenous languages, I mean, they operate almost in a kind of gestalt, a kind of opposite of like English, for example, right? That almost all that happens in Cherokee and Navajo are verbal, are conjugations, because the kind of noun, the cat is on the mat, right, where you have something and you say that it does something, those sorts of simplified sort of frameworks of language just have no space in indigenous language frameworks, because what's happening at a sort of broad sort of process level, almost like you think about it in other conceptualizations, like the waves on an ocean. Like the waves are not really things sort of separate from the ocean, like the cat and the mat are, but the waves, even the things, are just moments in time that the ocean sort of rippling around. And the way the sort of verbal nature of indigenous languages, that the things, nouns that we sort of depend on so much, almost have no place. It's all sort of verbal sort of conjugation of more complicated relationships that are articulated. It just creates a very different, even way of seeing reality, in this fundamental sort of shift, almost like, are things the main sort of building blocks of the universe? Are relations more real, and things sort of like just the manifestation of different relations? That kind of difference is something that I experience even in using the language and trying to communicate with people.
We are talking with Brian Burkhart about Indigenous philosophy. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein. I'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
And now we're back. You're listening to Brian Burkhart and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. We're talking about indigenous philosophy and the different ways that it conceives the world and language and fundamental philosophical questions. And I have all these terms and ideas and concepts that I want to ask you about, but I do want to ask first, did you find academic philosophy in the process welcoming to your project of indigenizing philosophy? We've had especially people of older generations on the show who, when they did feminist philosophy in graduate school, they felt really alienated and it was really uphill. And Africana philosophy was very much resisted. Did you have that experience too? Did you find philosophy welcoming or unwelcoming to what you wanted to do? And frankly, to who you are and what you brought to the table?
I do, know a lot of the people from that generation that you're describing in philosophy, even in Indigenous or Native American philosophy. And in some ways, those people going through an even harder time and sort of pushing through paved the way for me, right? So there's oftentimes sort of generations of this movement, that each group that sort of makes headway, gives the momentum, sometimes very small, little tiny bits of momentum to the next generation. So I'm grateful for that. My mentors, many of them that I had, even non-native people that I worked with in my PhD program, that were just 100% on board and so supportive, and just what bent over backwards to help me achieve what I wanted to achieve. But in the context of the overall sort of sense of whether what I was doing was valuable and my perspective was relevant to philosophy, I mean, I still, for the most part, have the experience of a negative reception. Sometimes even I tell some stories in the books that are actually kind of telling stories on people, but done in the trickster sort of way. No names are mentioned, and no one is sort of particularly injured. But some of the things that happen, where even at an APA meeting, I had someone try to jump across the table and punch me, on the basis of things that I was saying about indigenous philosophy, and the that seemed to reject the just the seeming assumed universality of Western thought, was met with violent response. Not just like, I don't think you should be here, but I'm going to sort of beat you up because of what you represent. So that's the pretty extreme form of that hostility, but it was kind of a very much a part of what I had to go through and sort of push through to be able to do what I want to do at the level that I have been able to.
An APA, for folks who don't know, is the American Philosophical Association. It's a
Yeah,
professional organization. Every young scholar
yeah.
has to be exposed to it, present papers, and there's a very standard way of approaching things, which I always talk about with my guests, because I very explicitly designed the radio show to be against this, where I would say the standard experience of being a philosopher is someone walking up to you and saying, I've never thought for a second about what you're talking about, but let me tell you why you're wrong. and and that
Exactly.
that can get so hostile. Now, in the book, you have these stories featuring this character, Iktomi, and Iktomi is creating allegories and stories and tales and anecdotes to illustrate the themes and the ideas which you otherwise discuss in academic, more technical prose. What is the importance of including those tales, and what does Iktomi give you that academic philosophy does not provide?
Okay, so there are a number of things. There are two things that we can separate from there. The storied part, and the Tome stories are using the trickster sort of framework. One, using stories, whatever they may be, forget about the fact that they're trickster stories here or that sort of framework, using stories in a kind of academic philosophical text provides not only a kind of more complicated dynamic sort of framework for speaking about words and meaning than the linear definitional, as we were saying, animals, humans. We can speak sort of beyond those binaries and sort of limitations, but it also expresses something that is itself dynamic, right? When we're talking about language and experiencing the world in a very sort of constant sense of motion and change, without all the static separation of things and definitions of one thing versus another, that kind of reality, to speak of it, is much more approachable in the context of stories, because stories are dynamic. When you hear a story, you experience a multiplicity, all kinds of feelings, all kinds of things happen, that isn't just one thing defined, as this versus another thing defined as that. And that kind of dynamic experience of indigenous thought, indigenous world, is opened up in a kind of storied context. So that's the first part. The second part is using the kind of trickster framework. And in one level, it sort of connects together, because trickster stories purposely push at our sense of dualities, of who is a good person, who's a bad person, who's in our community, who's out.
Brian, I want to interrupt for just a second.
Yeah,
I apologize.
yeah,
Can
yeah.
you tell
No, it's
can you
okay.
tell us what trickster means so that we
Yeah, yeah.
understand what the stories look like and the playfulness as well as the challenge that comes with this idea? What is a trickster?
So a trickster, and this becomes very important when we sort of talk about how the trickster method in relationship, particularly to philosophy as a whole. Like the trickster is in some ways a kind of contrary, sort of pushing on our expectations in indigenous thought, indigenous stories. They're kind of pushing on the boundaries, what you expect a person to do, what you expect, of any kind of framework of what is normal, what is proper. The trickster story will oftentimes push on that or even display it in his or her behavior. The things that you're not supposed to do, he will do, but in a way that makes you laugh. But what you find is you're kind of laughing at yourself in a critical way too, because as you laugh at Iktomi doing the silly things that he does, Iktomi is the Lakota spider trickster, and for example, I'll tell told me a story in like a single sentence or two, the story where he pulls up the timsala, which are the wild turnips on the plains. He pulls them up and he eats and eats and eats all these sort of timsala raw, which causes great, distress in his stomach to the point where he's eating hundreds and not thousands of these. And then he starts farting because he's got so much, timsala in his stomach, and he just keeps farting and he lifts himself up, and finally he goes off into space and is called Iktomi farts himself into space. It's a traditional story. It's very funny, but it's sort of like, yeah, maybe sometimes I like just want to eat, and I don't think about what that means. I don't think about my relatives. And seeing Iktomi doing that and laughing at him, you're kind of laughing at yourself, but you're also being exposed to a mirror. You're seeing yourself in the mirror in a way that allows you to reflect on your own actions without a direct proof against the validity of your claims in a philosophical sense, or even someone necessarily chastising you, telling you did this wrong, you need to do this. You come at it through this your own kind of reflective engagement of the story that makes you laugh, and you see yourself in a way that opens up in a sort of not fearful way, right? Because you're laughing and then you're laughing at yourself, and now you're thinking critically but also laughing. That's a place for a very positive reflection that isn't antagonistic. You don't have to defend yourself against anyone. You're laughing, but then maybe you can think critically and change something about what you've done or how you're thinking.
It's striking when hearing you describe it and when reading it in the book that we have, of course, tricksters in American culture. Bugs Bunny pops into my head. And we
Sure.
watch movies and we see paintings and we hear music and we have all of this storytelling experience that's ubiquitous in our life. And yet academic philosophy is very, very strict about storytelling. It's the feminists have done a really good job of pushing what they actually call narrative as opposed to storytelling in their texts. But there's something very weird, and I guess I'll ask you in this form, inadequate about philosophy if it excludes this storytelling, if it excludes this trickster methodology. Does that make academic Western philosophy inadequate because it's so hostile or resistant or maybe even incompatible with this approach of exploration?
Yes, I think so. I think those are the kinds of questions that I try to push on in writing the book to get people to, in the process of experiencing these kinds of both sort of funny, sort of seriousness is a very important part of doing Western philosophy properly. Like you can't tell a story and you can't laugh, right? It's all serious. It's, formal. You're doing this thing because you're finding truth. And those are such fundamental sort of features of our reality, particularly as human beings, and the way that we interact with the world, to just cut ourselves off from those things, as if we only bring our thinking caps to anything, and all the rest of us should be left behind really exposes a kind of limitation of what we call a kind of reflective engagement with the world and trying to relate to it in a meaningful way, to find meaning.
It's funny, there have been a variety of people throughout the history of philosophy who have experimented a little with this. There's a lesser known philosopher named Bernard Mandeville who did this. Voltaire did this. Nietzsche did it
Hmm.
to a certain extent.
Yeah,
And it
sure.
drove academics crazy. They had no idea how to deal with these people. And in many instances, Nietzsche is a good example, it took a century, right, for people to
Yeah,
really come to terms with this.
yeah,
I guess that highlights this tension at the core of your discussion, which I keep alluding to, and that this notion that Western philosophy, you refer to it, you anthropomorphize it as the Western thinker. The Western
yeah,
thinker discusses things categorically, universally, talks in propositions that are either true or false. And you contrast this with what you call localized thinking. And you used the word earlier in our discussion, particularist or particular. What is that distinction? And I will admit, I mentioned this in my initial emails to you, that
yeah.
the concept of local is very hard for me personally to grasp. So what does that mean, and how does it force us to change our perspective? Contrast it with that universality, and maybe even explain why it's a colonialist category as you do in the book.
Yeah, that's an important sort of part. As you said, we've kind of been pushing it back because it's a complicated conceptualization, and part of it is even the terms. And it's part of why, in general, when I discuss this, I do a lot of public speaking just to sort of broad, mostly academic audiences. I've even really kind of stopped using that term locality because people kind of they either like I don't know what that means at all, or I kind of do already. The things like particular or local, like oh I know it's local. I shop local. Like what is my local farmers market stuff that comes from here. I kind of know that like that's all we're talking about. But this is not. It's much more than that, and it's part of like in an indigenous context. It comes from the land, right? And land is also kind of a particular term of art for indigenous people who recognize it, land back, lots of things about land, but it's still a kind of term of art in these contexts. It's not just the land like the dirt. It is kind of that the land or the earth in a particular place that people are from or a part of is literally a part of them. It's a living relative, and not only just another relative that like I think of like wherever you go, there you are on land. We forgot about that. We don't just like walk through sort of conceptual space. We're standing on the earth. It's always there with us, but it's not just a thing we're standing on, like a stage we're walking across. It's another being that's a part of us. It's our relative. But also in a lot of indigenous thought, it's grounding, it's generating. People come out of the land, human elements, even of speech. In the Navajo story, the first 12 words that form the Navajo language are given to them by the four sacred mountains. They speak them out of these caves and give them to human beings. Like the earth, the land is not just sort of something for us to kind of think on top of and then make up our ideas. And so that creates a kind of particularity, a locality that isn't just about we happen to be here now, but it's something much deeper that is denied when we sort of pretend like, as Locke does in thinking about property and all those other things, that it's just a background for human existence or a resource that we can sort of take what we need from. And then imagine and construct all of our ideas sort of floating free from that particularity that is a part of us into just the truth of ethics or the truth of the world, the nature of human beings. All that stuff denies this fundamental groundedness that indigenous thought we have that comes out of our relationship to land that's always a part of us.
There's more going on in what you're saying. How can you help us as listeners make that jump to understand what else is there?
So an interesting place that I talk about this in the book, and I'll name this name here just because this person is very important to me, my sort of mentor in philosophy, and a very accessible to everyday sort of public people, indigenous thoughts and history. Vine Deloria Jr. He talks about this in his book called God is Red, what he calls the spatial point of view, right? Because how we think about place, even sort of particularity in Western thought, is just as you described there. It's sort of what happened to me there, right? What did human beings do in this place? Then it becomes important, it becomes sacred, it becomes significant because we did something there, just like you were saying, like on a stage. It's merely a stage for some things we did and we remember. But if you think that place is already a living reality, so like in the context of, the ideas about sacred places, that place is not significant, like Matotipila, which is called Devil's Tower in Wyoming, right? That place is not just a place where something maybe happened, or even where people from all over the plains have gone since time immemorial to do sundances. And remember, I was there, we did a sundance here. Well, the reason why we go there is because that is a particular kind of relative. It has a life, it has an energy, it does things for the world, for the earth, on its own. And the reason why we go there is to acknowledge its reality independent of us, to listen to it, to tell us how to live better lives, to minister back to it through ceremonies, to help it thrive, to give back to it so that it will continue to give to us. And that kind of relationship that is seeing the land and places as sort of living relatives that have memory and history and give things to us in a kind of exchange of kinship is a totally different conceptualization of the importance of place and space and even the sacredness of place that doesn't depend on human events that happen there.
So this is a really important shift because, right, what you're saying is it's not sacred because people went there. People went there because it's sacred, and it would be sacred even if people never went there. That it's
Exactly.
that what makes it sacred is fundamentally independent of the human being, and that the people who go there to experience it are lucky enough to be aware enough of the world to recognize that, right? So
Yeah,
what
for sure.
what then does the word sacred mean? Because for a lot of people listening, what it means
Hmm.
is a place we recognize as a special connection to the divine, or where we worship, or a place which you should be, watch your language, be respectful,
Yeah.
wear more conservative clothes, right? I mean, sacred is such a ritualistic, functional idea. What does sacredness mean if it's profoundly independent from the human beings who recognize or can identify the sacredness?
So if you think about it, like there's carryover between those kind of concepts at certain levels about the respect and how you speak and relate to those places, because places, indigenous thought, the place itself is a primary form of sacredness, is about the energy or even the power. I sort of think about it as like there is a power of a place, just like there can be a power in a person. Person could, whether you think of it as divine or not, a person could be very wise and really have a lot of, capacity to help you think through problems psychologically, or give you sort of healing advice. And how you treat that person, is very important to whether they are able to continue to be in that space to give that to you. So like our relationship as human beings and going to these sacred places is not about just respecting that kind of divinity. It's a part about a relationship of the power of this place that we have come to recognize over thousands and thousands of years, like Matotipila, or called Devil's Tower in English. People have been going there for tens of thousands of years, right? 2,000 years ago, if you look at the star alignment of is getting into the weeds, the star alignment of the constellations that reflect having the sun dance there at the summer solstice, they have been out of alignment for 2,000 years. So that means when people first started going there for the summer solstice, it had to be thousands of years before that. They come to that not just as some radical revelation that comes from divine, but through those relationships of constantly looking and seeing the things that are happening and listening to them and speaking back and developing this relational knowledge of how to act appropriately, just like you would with a person. There's not a rule book for how to have a good relationship with your partner or your neighbor. You have to like, well, what do you need and what can I give you? And you have that back and forth until you figure it out. And that takes a lot of time. And those are the kind of processes of those relationships and the understanding of what is the kind of sacrality in that.
Let's talk a little bit about this idea of relationality because it is another fault line that you identify between the indigenous approach and the Western thinker. And the Western thinker has a tendency to speak atomistically, to speak as if chemistry is different than biology, or morals are different than geography and things like that. And you challenge this notion and you argue that from the indigenous philosophy that you are describing, there's a much more connectedness and one that even creates a much more intimate relationship between indigenous science and indigenous morality and nature and ethics. What is relationality? Why is it important? How does it counter the way that the Western mind organizes the world?
Well, I think one way to kind of think about it that you can kind of try to conceptualize it in an abstract form of like thinking about the sort of the metaphysical picture, like even I was saying about waves on an ocean and the ocean itself versus a cat in a mat. It's kind of individual discrete things rather than a whole sort of complicated process that we're all a part of. But that doesn't really help us get down into the perspective as it's actually practiced. And the way that we can think about the perspective as it's actually practiced almost doesn't sort of require us to even think about or assume some reality as such about the nature of kinship and relationships. It's just that that's how we approach it. Everything that you see is a relative that you're in a kind of relationship to in some level, and it's speaking back to you. It doesn't have to speak in human language or be in a relation that would be like another human being, but we're all, in the Western sort of scientific perspective, we're all sort of just individual variations on the single phylogenetic tree of life. If you think about all biological organisms of every kind of sort. And so we're all sort of doing the same thing in different sort of forms. And we can conceptualize, even if we don't understand exactly, we can conceptualize our relationships to things through that kind of kinship and reciprocity. And then we engage in a kind of, interaction with them that isn't based on abstract, the nature of the human being versus the nature of the animal and what is proper for this or for that. But it's always on the ground, in motion, engagement with all the things around us that we run into or that we think about through this relationship of kinship. You are my relative. How do I act as a good relative to you? And it even undermines going back to the nature versus artifact, because it's not just about trees, it's also about the things that I have in my house, my blanket or my book that I have here. Everything I treat in a particular way, that I have to think about what that form of kinship or reciprocity is. And that's the kind of practice that creates that dynamic of engagement, that just creates a different kind of way of thinking about what is proper in those as a sort of form of relationality in that everyday kind of practice.
I love my wife, I love my daughter, I love my students. But I love them in very different ways, thankfully. And
Yeah.
what I mean and how I represent and how I understand that love varies from person to person, and also how I see myself, how I act, my level of vulnerability, what counts as intimacy is going to be very different when I love my wife, when I love my daughter, when I love my students. It's harder for me to understand what that reciprocal relationship is if I say I love a mountain. I love a tree. Now I can understand it on a very basic idea, which is, if you're hiking, you don't leave any trace of your hiking. You try not to poison the earth with, I don't know, pouring bleach on flowers or something. But there's certainly I'm getting something deeper and something more
Mhm.
meaningful about the reciprocal relationship of being localized in, let's say, that mountain path.
Yeah.
Is there any way to communicate what that is? How do I take the next step in understanding what you're trying to articulate?
Well, it's challenging. One thing to start with is to recognize the difficulty of going from where we're at to there, and but recognizing that there is a kind of like where we're at sort of has a particular journey we've already made, right? We sort of have kind of conceptualized, just like we did with land and place as a stage, we've conceptualized what kinship is and what human beings are in relationship to land already with a lot of normativity and sort of nuance that is not the foundational point, not how things are articulated in indigenous context. So, for example, like I said, even about the Navajo and the four sacred mountains that give literally kind of generate out of the wind out of the caves, human language. These places have realities that are living and breathing and engaging in, actions like that, like giving, to people and generating dynamic kinships in various forms. Like Cherokee, for example, have this sort of famous in our kind of tradition story of the origin of medicine and disease, where this treaty that was developed between human beings and animals and plants thousands and thousands of years ago was broken by the human beings. Like, how are we going to be in this dynamic relationship? The humans upset it and they started just kind of abusing everything and taking whatever they wanted. And so there was a big conflict that came. And the animals put all these diseases that were going to destroy the human beings. The plants came and tried to resolve it and produce all this medicine. And then they kind of got together and they figured out a way to kind of like move forward. And that's a great story because it just doesn't tell us about some natural way of being, of how a mountain is supposed to be. It's that these are ongoing dynamic kinship relationships that we have to constantly be enacting, figuring out how to be in a proper relationship to these relatives that are there, not just as things we can walk across or trees we can cut down, but in a dynamic sort of dialogical exchange, a kind of back and forth, a conversation, that has undergone all kinds of dynamics in sort of indigenous history of thousands and thousands of years, for example.
Whenever we have conversations about difference, about diversity, about cross-cultural stuff, there's a tendency to talk about how, well, at the root, we're all the same, and here are some commonalities. And then there are folks who will approach it, well, we are fundamentally different, here's why. And when you have that later discussion, you risk falling into, and this isn't exactly the right word in this context, but what Edward Said called Orientalism, right?
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
other someone, you romanticize them, you make them a caricature. And so even though you claim to be describing who they are and what they're doing, you're really defining them in terms of yourself and defining them in terms of a fundamental fiction. How do we
Yeah.
have this conversation about indigenous philosophy without falling into this kind of Orientalism, without falling into a kind of romanticism that you refer to at various different points in the book with various different thinkers who do
Yeah. Yeah.
versions of this, who
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
this very reductionist idea of what it means. How do we avoid that pitfall?
Well, one thing I think we can do is we can separate out a kind of a binary between what it means to get right, indigenous thought on its own terms, or say nothing, right? We're like, or we get it right, or we just kind of do our own thing over here, right? We kind of sort of think that what we're always doing is actually something more complicated. I mean, we're already when we're sort of taking this stuff and thinking about it, like we're already in it. We're already situated in relationship to it. Either as kind of like I'm going to stay away from it, or I'm going to kind of try to do something with it. And so if we think a level sort of deeper about what we're doing and why and the kind of accountability, then when we sort of think about those things or even try to appreciate them or relate them to our lives, we do so, I think, in a less damaging way, right? That we can try to think about these things not just as either appropriative or sort of something we should reject, but how do we sort of think about those things and relate them to our own lives, even if they're sort of different experiences and different language, in a way that respects those ways and those traditions, but also is meaningful to me, whoever I am, wherever I am. And so, like, I try to get, people that ask me these kinds of questions, particularly in public spaces, where, like, how do I start sort of thinking about this? Well, I think anybody can begin to just think about the place that they're in relational terms, and even have conversations with the land that you care about, even if that's a starting place. You walk out behind your house or on a trail, go to the river that you like or up the mountain path, and start to think about it and try to relate to it in a way that doesn't make you a kind of indigenous person living off the land, but it opens up a space that I think is my sort of sense, as I describe in the book, is that this is not just different ways of thinking about the world, different traditions, but there is this reality of the livingness of the land that we're a part of underneath our attempts to kind of deny it or ignore it to produce universal truth. So we can all kind of go back in a way, think about the history of the place and all of its stories and traditions that go back thousands of years, and then also try to relate to it in a personal way, to listen to it, to try to speak to it, whatever that means to you. I think that opens up a space that's sort of beyond that either or, if it's done in that kind of meaningful and respectful way.
We're struggling right now because a few weeks ago we had some very serious storms, and we have this massive
Yeah.
elm tree in our backyard,
Mm,
about 100 years
yeah.
old, 40 some odd foot, and a massive limb fell off, destroyed our neighbor's garage, messed our
Mhm.
garage. We have to cut it down. And
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking. It's
Yeah.
expensive. It's going to change the way we see our backyard. But at the same time, when I pay attention to the tree, I recognize that there is this gaping wound that will not heal, that this tree is
Hmm.
dying, and I need to attend to that. Is that
Hmm.
getting closer to what you're describing? This sense that the tree can be understood as something that has a history, that's something that's living, that's something that is wounded, and that it decides for itself in a way what has to happen no matter how much we want the tree to stand.
Yes, I mean, I think we're opening up a space where we're starting to kind of peer in a little bit to a different way of seeing those things, even like the tree, right? So, like, even just thinking about, okay, this tree has been there. It's been sitting there providing shade for 40 years. You said it's been giving that, right? It's been giving of itself for all the things around it. I mean, it's also taken in life and nutrition, but it's been in this kind of reciprocal exchange where it's given much of itself, and it's sort of like, yeah, my time is done, right? I did what I could do. I had a great run. Now it's my time, and being able to see that and even honor that, right? To be able to just go out simply and just acknowledge, like, Mr. Mrs. Tree, I'm grateful for what you have given to this community, to my life, to my children, to the animals, all this stuff. We appreciate and are grateful and acknowledge that. That's a form of engaging in that reciprocity that seems very simple and subtle and not very spectacular perhaps, but it's sort of the heart of something really deep in that form of relationality and respect and kinship that is essential to the indigenous perspective of that as I see it.
And you're talking about these ideas of kinship and relationality, and you're using the word respect. And in
Hmm.
the Western tradition, perhaps the greatest advocate for this idea of respect is Kant. And Kant argues,
Yeah,
and it's obviously overly simplistic, but Kant argues
yeah,
that every individual is entitled to respect because they have intrinsic value and you have to treat them as persons, and they are their own people with autonomy who are trying to reach some kind of maturity. And it is a moral imperative to treat an individual with respect because of who they are. But in the book, you take issue with that in the sense that you are arguing for a more relational perspective of what respect means. How does your
yeah.
approach to indigenous philosophy challenge this Kantian idea, this individualistic, what the political tradition calls liberal individualism, this individualistic notion of respect and autonomy? How does relationality and kinship change the process and the acknowledgement of what it means to respect someone else?
Well, I think actually there's an interesting way that there's a little bit of the kind of Kantian perspective, and then a lot of something else in how I think about it. And it's sort of like in the book, I sort of use the idea that everything is sacred, and I kind of uh, take from things like Chief Seattle's sort of speech, and various sort of ways that we sort of describe this kind of relationality, that we're all kind of connected, and the tree is sort of as sacred as me, and all of it is about this kind of relational living sort of land that we're a part of, and that at a certain level that demands respect. We have to acknowledge those things as relatives, whatever they are. Tree, a little ant colony, all of those things sort of matter as much as anything else in a certain sense. But that doesn't really sort of tell us, that's just sort of like these things all matter. And respect in this sense is somewhat vacuous. It's not like it really tells us what to do. It's more just like these things deserve acknowledgement and recognition as sort of beings, as relatives, as kinship in the world, as you run into them, as you see them, as you reflect on them. But then what happens is that what determines those kinds of forms of the particularity of relationality are not some abstract set of principles that all beings, whether they're human in the Kantian sense with particular sort of intrinsic features, or all beings, whatever they may be, deserve respect, and respect is sort of articulated as certain kind of duties, obligations, behavior to all beings of a certain sort. The dynamic of how you engage in kinship ethics is based on the kinship itself. It is a reciprocity, and it's a kind of relationship that isn't based on abstract principles of you treat a tree like this, you treat a person like this, you treat a dog like this, here are all the rules. That you have to be in that relationship, and it's a kind of give or take that is based on that conversation. You don't just treat your wife or your children how some book tells you how to treat them, right? You treat them based on a back and forth of acknowledging this is what I need. Okay, I can give you this. Oh, it's not quite what I need, what feels right to me, and you work that out, and you recognize what they're giving you. They recognize what you're giving them, and this gratitude, like respect, is much more about than engaging in this reciprocal relationship of kinship, and this giving, and acknowledging the receiving, and all the elements that are from the tree to the water that we drink, the support and genuine companionship that my little dog, has gives to me, and I try to give back to him, the things that I can in taking care of him. Those are all the particularities of that kinship ethics that aren't determined by some abstract rules of categories of being and what is proper for this or that based on those sets of rules.
We're running out of time. There's one more question that I want to ask, although I often come up with last minute ones that pop into my head. You tell a story in the book of the formation of the national parks, and in particular, you talk about Teddy Roosevelt, which is particularly important for us here in North Dakota. And
Yeah,
you say that what before they were parks, they were deemed wilderness. And what made them wilderness was that there were Native Americans living on the land, and that was part of its wildness. Once
yeah,
they declared them national parks, they had to remove the residents of the parks because now they were not wild. Now Native Americans signified interference with the land. And so the very definition of what the society, what the government, what the laws describe natives to be changed with their own personal political needs. And so the question I have
correct.
is it preferable, is it even possible to look at Indigenous philosophy separate from the political context and the history and the colonialism and the exploitation of what happened, and to ask what it is in and of itself? Or is Indigenous philosophy necessarily a philosophy of liberation, a philosophy of response, that if you don't acknowledge the history and the context, you are not ever going to really understand what's happening? Can Indigenous philosophy stand on its own, or must it always be interacting with, subject to, reacting to the political context that has done such damage to so many people for so long?
Yeah, I think that there's a kind of necessary feature of the kind of liberatory framework of indigenous philosophy that can't be ignored. I mean, sometimes people try to do it, just like, oh, what is the religious, and just sort of carve it out as like, here's a religious belief versus this. But as we were seeing in our conversation, you look at any of these, the particularity even of, how we construct what is a place like a piece of land described as wilderness. What is a sacred place, or a place that's sort of protected as a national park, like where, Devil's Tower, national forest, those sorts of things are, is not something that we can just sort of look at as sort of two different ways of thinking about them, because the entire kind of framework, not just philosophically, but legally and politically, of the idea of place, property, and national park, and those sorts of things are all framed out of a particular way of conceptualizing land. I mean, why is it that in every kind of Supreme Court case where Indigenous people have proposed, here is why this place is sacred and these particular things shouldn't happen on them, from things like Devil's Tower in Wyoming, or Maltotipila and people wanting to climb it during Sundance sort of time, or the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, where I'm from, near Flagstaff, and when the Snow Bowl wanted to create or expand their sort of ski resort using kind of, wastewater, like water from toilets, to spray, to sanitize and spray right onto where the rain spirits or the Kachina spirits are. And you articulate this in the context of a Western legal system, and they're like, yeah, it's just about its property, right? Who has access to it? How do we determine that? Its reality as a kind of living relationship, none of that sort of matters, right? Religion as that sort of form just is not acknowledgeable in the context even of our legal system, much less our philosophical system. It's just like those things don't count because they are about a living land, and it's treating it in a particular way, where land is just sort of property, who has property rights and so on is what matters. You go to a church to have your religion. If someone's barring you from going to your church, that's different. But if you're trying to say, your church is the land, and sort of itself being treated in a particular way undermines its kind of spiritual significance. That there's no place for that. And so you have to work through, this kind of structure in order to even be able to really have the conversations in any space that begin to clarify how it's not just one way of thinking about it versus another, but a whole system of thinking that's been built on the denial of all of these kind of indigenous perspectives in relationship to land underneath it through concepts of property and all those sorts of things um, that build upon that system of thought.
Well, this is a hard place to leave the conversation,
Yeah.
but there has to be an end. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us on why this has been interesting, challenging. I've learned a lot,
Yeah.
and reading the book was a very, very interesting experience, both in terms of my own knowledge and in terms of how do I advocate for your ideas on the radio. And I
Mhm.
appreciate having you as a guide and your help and your writing. Thank you so much for joining us on Why.
No, no problem. I'm so happy to be here.
You have been listening to Brian Burkhart and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions in Everyday Life. I'll be back right after this.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyinpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We've been talking with Brian Burkhart about indigenous philosophy, how it counters Western philosophy, traditional academic philosophy, his own experience in the academy, and the things that we can learn about this very long-standing, complex, sophisticated tradition that we very rarely get exposed to. And I think the stuff that I want to highlight actually came out at the end, which is this question I asked about the political context, and this realization that someone who does the kind of work that Brian does necessitates having one foot in the Western world and one foot in the indigenous world, one part of the brain on the legalistic political context and one part of the brain in this cultural, relational, tribal history and peoples that he clearly has very intimate relationships with, right? He has to have these experiences and talk about his life and be in the world in the way that he's learned to be in the world, but he also, like the rest of us on the show, had to get tenure and write books and things like that. And that's a hard road to walk. It's a very difficult thing to have one foot in different worlds. And some of us have, 6 feet in different worlds, if you allow me the metaphor. We often try to translate from one to the other. We often try to ask, well, what does this German word mean in English? And what is this indigenous idea? How does it translate to Western philosophy or vice versa? And that's a useful skill to start. But the real hard bit is asking, what does this idea look like from inside the tradition? What does this idea look like from inside the culture? How do we learn and listen and try to experience, this isn't the best word, but an authentic account of the idea and the concepts that Brian is trying to articulate? We, as, if I'm talking to outsiders right now, we as outsiders will never get the experience that, when I address insiders, you will get. People who are not indigenous will not fully understand and never fully be able to understand the indigenous experience, the indigenous philosophy, just the way that the Cherokee and the Navajo and the Lakota will not always understand each other. We're all different. Cultures are different. Histories are different. People are different. Ideas are different. What's important is to recognize that we are always engaged in the tension between what something is in and of itself and an idea for itself and the relationship we have with that idea. We try to learn, we try to listen, we try to describe, we try to develop a sense of what things can be. And even if it's not perfect, even if it's not authentic, even if it's not the final goal, that still doesn't mean it's not valuable. What we're doing is important, what we're doing is essential, and what Brian gave all of us today, whether we are Indigenous or not, is a tremendous amount to think about and a challenge that I think we are all up for. With all of that said, if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public, please know that a longer version with almost 30 more minutes of discussion is available online and as a podcast. Visit yradioshow.org to listen or subscribe for free. For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and Spotify to help spread the word about the show. Follow us on all the usual social networks. Our handle is always at yradioshow, and please help us continue broadcasting by making your tax-deductible donation at yradioshow.org. Click donate in the upper right-hand corner to go to UND's alumni donation portal. We exist solely on the money you provide. Thank you yet again to my guests, the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer Tay Calloway, with special assistance from Daniel Webster this month. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, signing off for Y Radio. Thanks for listening. As always, it's an honor to be with you.
Y is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. The music is written and performed by Mark Weinstein and can be found on his album Lua y Sol. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.